Hey everyone, this is Carter. Welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I get to sit down with other writers and do some mind melding, do some investigation, some interrogation, some conversation, and find out what their deal is. And I've talked to a range of different writers so far, some who have been in this business decades and decades, and others who are just starting out. And today's guest was an example of somebody who's probably towards the beginning of what's going to be probably a very long and successful publication journey. Today I talked to Clare Whitfield, and a novelist, and her debut novel, People of Abandoned Character, came out in 2020, and it's got a great pretense about kind of like, what if you realized the person you were married to was in fact Jack the Ripper. So I love that. And I will say it's one of the most gorgeous book covers I've seen in a long time. So definitely check out People of Abandoned Character. And, did she fall into writing, Claire? I don't know. I don't know if you could say she fell into writing, but kind of. She was going to be a dancer. And, and then like all of us, we need to make money. And she was looking for something and started working as an editorial assistant for a publishing company, and started writing. So, maybe that book was in her all along, just waiting to come out. And she's a great conversationalist, and she makes me laugh. She's funny as hell. So I think you'll probably find this conversation we had to be pretty entertaining. So here it is. This is my conversation with Clare Whitfield. Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, happy evening. What is it, 9:00 there?
Yeah, it's 9:00 just.
And you're a bit of a night owl, are you?
Definitely. Yeah, I'm not a morning person, put it that way. So I have to be a night owl.
So where exactly are you?
I live in, it's a little village called Basildon,
Okay.
and it's in between Southampton and Portsmouth. So Southampton being where the Titanic set sail from. So I'm right at the bottom of England, right at the bottom in the middle.
Okay. And so is that where you're from? Did you grow up there specifically, or somewhere else in the UK?
No, I'm my accent might give it away to some people, but I'm from South London originally.
Okay. Okay. And so you just how long were you there for? Like, at what point did you move out from South London?
I moved down. I keep saying I'm not from here, and I've been saying that. I moved down when my daughter was 6 months, and she's going to be 17 this year, and I'm still telling people that I'm not from here. I don't know it. It's all villagey. I moved down in, it must be 2005, something like that. So
So is that a psychological I'm not from here kind of a thing? Like, you don't want to be from there, and is that offending
you
to
know
all of
what? I
your
think
friends
it's
and
probably
neighbors?
true. It was a real culture shock, honestly. I know it sounds pathetic, but apparently, by the way, my accent, according to my husband, who is from here, he says I've poshed up a lot. He said when he first heard me speaking, it was like nails down a blackboard, because I had a really,
The
really
original Eliza Doolittle.
yeah. He said it was awful. It was like ow, ooh. It was like nails down a blackboard. He said it was awful. So I poshed up apparently. Um, but it was a real culture shock moving from London. I just thought, and this is a proper London bubble thing, I just thought everywhere in England was like London.
Hmm.
And
And
then I moved out of
why did you move?
because my partner at the time, who was my daughter's father, he was headhunted for a job and I was pregnant, and they basically offered him double the salary. So it seemed like an offer you cannot refuse.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he didn't, and you moved, but you stayed.
Yeah. Yeah, I did stay, ditched the guy, kept the baby, and got a new man. So yeah,
There you
I'm pretty
go.
much tied up down here. So London's a big place, and I didn't grow up in a nasty part of London. I grew up in a London suburb. So you've got the tube map with all the lines, and I'm at the bottom of the black one, which is called the Northern Line. And I grew up in a place called Morden.
Okay.
I grew up on a council estate, so I'm assuming you have these. I don't know what you call them. It's like you rent it from the council, you rent your property from the government, the local council. So we didn't own our house.
Okay.
Like social housing, I guess you'd call it. I don't know.
Okay.
But it was a big, big, big estate, and they have kind of a bad rap. But maybe I was looking through rose tinted child glasses, but it was absolutely fine and had a
Sure.
great time. We were proper like normal, bog standard, working class family. I'm the youngest of four by a good stretch. So there was the three clumped together, and then God knows what happened to their contraceptive plan, but they ended up with me like 8 years later.
Yeah. It
Both
sounds
of my
like there probably
parents,
wasn't a plan,
yeah, there wasn't a plan. Let's face it, there wasn't a plan.
but
And
that's okay.
mum was ex Royal Air Force,
Hmm.
but left when she had kids. And my dad had been in the Navy and had left just before I was born. So I was kind of the only child that was had him around as a dad when he
Yeah.
wasn't, away for months at a time on overseas or on a ship. So I think I was probably a little bit indulged
Yeah.
from the father's side because he let me get away with murder.
Well, you had probably had an opportunity to grow a lot closer to him than your siblings did, which is less indulgent than just, a kind of a blessing.
Yeah, I don't know. He was a very like laid back kind of guy. My mum was the full on Hitler of the family and was really scary. All the kids locally were
You
petrified
referred
of
to her
her.
that way?
Yeah, yeah, honestly, she loved it. She just had these sort of like amazing black eyes where she would just look at all the local children and they'd just freeze. Do you know what I mean? She was one of those
Wow.
ladies,
Wow.
really
Yeah.
hard as nails. When she told you to pick up your toys, pick up your toys because he's going to set them on fire.
Wow.
You get like one chance. But my dad was always like Mr. Laid Back. And I think where he was around, because when I was around, he kind of got lumbered with me a bit more.
Yeah.
So I think I was a lot more feral, maybe is the word. Like he would leave me with him. They both
Yeah.
work shifts and different things. So like a lot of the time I'd be with one parent or the other parent, and the others would be out because they were so much older. And whenever I'd be left with my dad at the weekend, because my mum worked weekends, like I wouldn't get dressed or I wouldn't wash or I wouldn't brush my hair, and I'd probably be in the garden playing with twigs. And do you know what I mean? It was like
Yeah.
that dad parenting. No offense.
It's so interesting that both of your parents had military attachment, and your mom kind of sounds like she was, even beyond stereotypical, kind of regimented.
Oh yeah.
And your father was just the opposite. So do you see both of those influences in yourself today as a parent?
I would say just on that though, my dad was very laid back, but he had a lot of regimented things in him in terms of money.
Yeah.
That man hated spending money. And he
Mhm.
was like, he would go to Olympic levels. And I think that was very sort of military. Everything had to be organized and sort of rationed out. So this was a man, I mean, there was four children and three girls,
Yeah.
and he would set the boiler so there was a certain amount of hot water. And once that hot water ran out,
That's it.
that's your problem. And I remember there was this big thing where it was like, we've all got hair, and we were like, but it's not long enough. We can't wash the conditioner out of our hair. And his
Cut your
solution would
hair.
be cut it off. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So
It's
he did have
practical.
that military side of things. Yeah, very practical. And
That's
if we
interesting.
had a certain amount of, this is awful, but I think this is just the indicative of the time, is like we had a certain amount of toilet paper. And
Yeah.
when you've got four kids, obviously, what are they doing with the toilet paper? Let's face it. But you had your allotment of toilet paper for the week. Once that was gone, that
Right.
man would sit down with the local free newspaper
Oh no,
and
no,
cut it
no,
into
no.
squares.
The same paper you'd use for your fish and chips.
Yeah, basically, and he would sort of pile it up on the loo, and it was like you'd sort of even it got to the it did work in sort of military divide and conquer sort of methods because like you'd even start attacking each other, be like, "Don't use so much toilet paper."
He said, "Sweetie, decades from now, there's going to be a global pandemic, and I'm just getting you ready."
Yeah, it's training. I feel well equipped for this. It was all for a reason. Sorry, you did ask me a question before I went off on a tangent. What was it? How does it influence
Well,
me?
so you know, like I said in my email, I don't like the typical writer podcast where I'm asking you what you're reading or what's that kind of a thing. I'm super interested in just the evolution of how somebody one kind of almost discovers their creativity, and then the extension of that actually masochistically decides to become a writer. And so I'm always curious about how their childhood kind of their upbringing affected that. So to the extent that your parents had influence on that, were either of them within kind of a creative realm that you'd say, or not so much?
Um, I'd say that's a toughie. My mum was the reader. I don't think my dad had ever read a book in his
Yeah.
life. My mum was the reader, but it was like really trashy, maybe not trashy,
You can
just
say
it sounds
trashy.
really awful. Romance novels,
Yeah.
which to me is like I don't do
Well, there's been
romance at
such
all.
an
And not that
evolution of romance novels over the decades, right? So decades ago, I think that's probably a pretty apt term.
yeah, I think it was very Mills and Boons heavy sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or it would be very much like Northern Woman overcomes life of hardship sort of tales.
Oh.
Um, so I never really got into the book she was reading. Both of them were really big into music, I would say.
Hmm.
That was probably, but very different tastes. So my mum was really into her Ella Fitzgerald and like Shirley Bassey and things like that. And my dad was much more eclectic. He was very much into the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and the
Yeah.
Sex Pistols and Vangelis and classical music. He loved Holst, and so he was really eclectic,
Yeah.
but massively into his music. Um, I'd say there was. It's the weird thing was I never really thought of myself. I never. I think how I got into words was through being the youngest. Your superpower or your only power is probably your tongue,
Yeah.
because let's face it, I wasn't winning any fights in that
Right.
house.
Right. And 8 years removed from your second youngest sibling, there's a competition or there's a desire to be heard. That's
Yeah,
constantly an uphill battle, I would imagine.
yeah, I think when you've got that gap and you've got the 3 and, a little one, you could turn out one of 2 ways. I think you can either turn out very mousy, very quiet,
Yeah. Right.
or you fight, or you're what is it they used to call me? The yappy little dog. You're like one of those yappy little dogs that
Right.
doesn't realise how small it is.
Right.
Um, And I was definitely that one. And I think I'm not going to win any fights. They're basically going to hold me down and spit on my head or tie me to the chair and leave me in the dark. And, all the magical things that
Right.
siblings do to you.
Right. Did your
But
did your parents stay together?
yeah, they did, but they shouldn't have. They
Yeah.
shouldn't have.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were chalk and cheese. It's like they should have separated years before, but they were of that generation where I think they're both dead, they're both passed away some years now, and it's quite sad because all of us feel the same, as in, they both should have left each other and found other people and found happiness or, done other things, but I think they were both of that generation where they were afraid of leaving and
And it certainly
financially.
wasn't as common either.
100%. And I think, like that generation as well, like they got together, they were married from the ages of 20 and 21.
Hmm.
Must have been, but they ended up really hating each other.
Oh,
So, but we were used to it. We'd grown up with them fighting and we'd grown up with them. It was kind of weird to grow up and go around friends' houses and realize that not everybody had that.
right. Right. Yeah, for sure. They didn't have the mothers with the black eyes that would make animals like stop in their
Freeze
tracks.
children and set things on fire. Yeah, yeah, definitely she was a character. Yeah, some of their mums were really laid back and like kindly, but
Yeah. So as you were
it was,
going through school, were you feeling and so first of all, it's interesting that you said when when I got into words, nobody really has said that on this podcast before. That's a really interesting way of putting it, because it is, it's not like I want to become a writer. I want to effectively communicate, however that is. But as you started progressing through school, did you start finding an attraction to literature? Did you, start making up stories, or did you? Can you look back and see kind of your genesis of wanting to storytell?
yeah, definitely. I It's funny how you think of it though, isn't it? Because if you think of writers and books, that felt very otherly and belonged somewhere else to other people.
Yes.
Um, I was good at my training, obviously giving it large in class. So I went to a couple of schools that were quite rowdy, for, perhaps not the best schools. And being small again, one way of not getting your head kicked in, I found, was to, this sounds awful, so forgive me,
You're in a safe
but
place.
if you heckled the teacher and made them look stupid, then it was kind of a way of protecting yourself from the bigger kids, the cooler kids.
Right. And
And
you
I
had a talent
certainly,
for that?
yeah.
Huh.
So I did
That's
that a
good.
lot. And but funnily enough, I always did really well in my English lessons, and my teachers always really, I mean, I had a lot of teachers that you can understand hated me,
Mhm.
but my English teachers always were really encouraging. And I think there's probably a couple of teachers in my life that I still remember and I think of really good big influences, and they really encouraged me. I struggled to read books, if I'm honest,
Sure. Me too.
because the
Yeah.
literature they put in front of you is so stuffy.
Right. Right. Unrelatable. Right. If you're 15 and you're reading The French Lieutenant's Woman, you're like, oh,
Oh God,
it's
yeah.
not.
And
Yeah.
I tell you the one that, and it's a great book, and I've seen the movie, but I can't quite bring myself to read it because of this torture. It was Of Mice and Men, I think it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Is it John Steinbeck?
Yes.
And I cannot read that book, but everyone's like, "Oh, it's an amazing book," and I'm like, it has been ruined for me because when you learn about
Because of
these
your
books in
experience.
school, they suck the joy, don't they? They
Right.
absolutely suck the joy out of
Right.
it.
It probably 2 years ago. I went and reread for the first time since high school, Great Gatsby, which is only something like 165 pages. And I sat down and this is this is a tremendous book. I really loved it, and all I remember was how boring and how analytical we had to be about it. And I'm like, the author
Yeah.
wasn't thinking all this stuff, please. But yeah, so I can relate to that.
And can I just say, isn't it
Yes,
annoying the way that there's always one right way of interpretation?
correct.
So, like, it'd be like the author is saying what? And I'm like, how do you know?
Right. Oh, I remember having to write essays about Hamlet's soliloquy and what we thought he was actually talking about. And you would just make stuff up because you didn't know. And yeah, it was and like, no, no, this is what he means. I'm like, well, how
This
do
is the
you know?
right
Did you talk
interpretation.
to
It must
Shakespeare?
be
Right.
this. Okay.
And then did you go on to university?
I did, yeah. So I did surprisingly okay in my exams, which shocked everyone, to be honest, even me and
Hmm.
my dad, especially my dad, because he'd done this motivation thing where he said in your exams, basically, if you get I was the first one in my family to ever go on to further education. Everyone
Oh,
else left at school
right.
as soon as they could. And so he thought he was on to a winner here. He said, I'll give you like £20 for an A, I'll give you £10 for a C, um, £15 for a B, and £20 for an A. And I got all A's to C's and two A stars, which is like an A plus.
Wow.
And so he was like absolutely shocked, as was I. And he was also absolutely annoyed because he
It's
hated
like, I can
spending
afford
money,
this.
and he was like
Right.
shelling it out.
I'm gonna have to really cut off the hot water now to be able to pay for this.
Yeah, yeah. No showers and no toilet paper. But moved to university, but I upset them a lot because um, I ended up taking a dance degree.
Mm. I bet he was
So,
thrilled with that.
well, you can imagine. You can imagine that he was. I'm not. I think the sentence was, "I'm not paying for you to mince about in a leotard." Something like that. You can understand. I'll pay for you to be a
Mince
solicitor.
about.
Yeah, or a profession,
Right.
but I am not paying you to mince about in a leotard. Um, but I think funnily enough, my laser eye mum was very supportive, and I think a lot of it was they were so thrilled to get a child that was actually going to go to
For
university
sure.
that it was a real status thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did manage to go, and also it was politically it was an important time because in the UK it used to be free.
Yeah.
And I think mine was the last year where there were no tuition fees. So
Oh,
in terms of what that meant, it was like my parents were like, "You go this year or you don't go," because we're
right.
not, you know, from that background. I think a lot of people are much more comfortable with taking loans out now, and it's kind of a thing. But they were like, If you're not doing it for free, you're not going."
Right. And they hadn't been saving up because they didn't know that it wasn't going to be free, and it wasn't commonplace that anyone would go on in your family, it sounds like.
100%, yeah,
So they're not, it's not like they had a well of money saved up for you to mince about in leotards.
in leotards, yeah, which is exactly what I did.
So you graduated, and what do you do? Can you start dancing?
No, I had a bit of a revelation in my last year, which I never told anyone about because obviously I don't think it would have gone down well. Where I was like, I loved to dance. I was good at it. And it was really stupid because, like a lot of the arts, you get to that point, don't you, when you think, oh my God, is that how much I'm going to earn? How am I ever going to survive? How am I going to pay for somewhere? How am I going to do
Right.
anything? How am I going to? And also, there was this strange feeling. I felt very mute. Which sounds stupid because obviously I was dancing, so no, I wasn't speaking, but I felt very mute. I felt very so in the last year, I started doing more extra modules of like script writing
Hmm.
and TV production, things like that, that I thought would help me diversify. And I left university. There was no way for me to do professional dancing. I needed more money, and quite frankly, it wasn't there. So I I managed to get a job as an editorial assistant for a business to business publishing house. I mean, it was
Okay.
like the most boring magazines you can
Sure.
imagine,
But it was words.
but it was words,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think and I was also, what else did I do? I was the manager of the web hosting company. So this was back, when did I graduate? 1999. God, yeah. This was back when the
Oh
internet
yeah, that's
was
so.
new.
Yeah.
It was cool, like the internet, the shiny new thing.
Right. Right.
And I had to write news for this website. And also, one of my jobs was to upload the news to Reuters every day, which was really boring. And I also was in charge of the internet system, like the whole connection.
Yeah.
And if ever it failed, I had to reboot. And what that meant
Plug
was
the
I
phone line
walked,
back in.
yeah. But I was under threat of death never to tell anyone else about this because otherwise they'd all be in there doing it
Right.
all the time. So
Right.
they'd be like,
Right.
"Oh, we need a reboot," and I'd like one below utility belt, drop and roll.
Right. You have no idea what a big deal this is that I have to do
Yeah.
this again. But isn't it interesting that you're graduating university, and you're I think probably logically seeing that there's maybe not a lot of money to be made in professional dancing, although there can be.
Yeah.
But logically, there's not a lot of money to be made in writing either. but yet you kind of went back to that whole thing from your childhood of like, I want to be heard. And that kind of
Yeah.
that
Right.
parlayed itself into, I need, if I'm dancing, I'm not being heard. That it seemed like that equated that for you. So whatever you can get into where you have a voice, it seems like that's what you gravitate towards, whether or not there was a lot of money in it or
Yeah, I'm still that yappy little Yorkshire Terrier.
not. So you were working along that for a while, and then how did what was the path to fiction?
A long one. So
Yeah.
this sounds really awful, but during my time working really hard at the B2B publishing house, I basically spent a lot of time writing fiction
Mm.
at my desk.
Like short fiction?
No, just I started writing a book. Well, I
Hmm.
didn't even know what I was writing, I'll be
Right.
honest.
Yep. Sounds like
But I
me.
started writing and it just went on and on and on and on. I remember it was about 55,000 words, which I'd
Mm.
done 100% in work time, by the way.
Right.
Um, but that's the good thing about working in words. It's like,
Right. Nobody knows you're
you're
not,
right.
nobody knows whose words those are.
Yeah, I'm writing news, honest. Um, but I don't even know what it was. And I saved it down on a floppy disk because that's what you did back then.
Sure.
And then the whole internet bubble burst. Like, content wasn't paid for
2001. Yeah.
and I got made redundant,
No.
which I
Yeah.
was fine about. I remember being called into the CEO's office and he was like so apologetic about it. And I was like, when you're young, you're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, whatever." And he asked me if I wanted anything. And I was thinking of my book and I looked at and I saw this pile of floppy disks and I said, "Can I take some floppy disks?" And he was like, "Okay." It's like,
My
I remember
severance
taking a
pay.
big handful of them, thinking that how useful that was.
Yeah. Right. I can store lots of my own stories on these things.
Yeah, yeah. And then I ended up getting a job basically as a copywriter, a junior copywriter. So I spent the next few years writing copy because I thought that would be creative. Yeah. I was like, right, what am I going to do? I want to be creative with words. I know I'm going to be a copywriter. And I wrote brochure material,
Hmm.
the least creative. It's like if you like working with words, I suggest don't work in advertising or copywriting because it is like where souls go to die,
Hmm.
you
I've heard
know?
that before. Yeah. And did that culminate in People of Abandoned Character, or were there books before that?
Um, so I kind of got to my mid-30s really. My little girl was a bit older and I wanted to take an evening class, just to get out of the house and stop being mum, in that mum
Sure.
zone thing. And so I did creative writing and I did lots of silly stories and lots of fun things, and that's all it was really. I thought it might be nice to do an MA at
Yeah.
one point. Um, and then I did a workshop at this adult education class, and it was a workshop, and the exercise was she gave out all these news articles, and they were news articles from the 1888 Jack the Ripper being reported in the news, the murders.
Right.
And the teacher said, right, you've got to write a piece, and it's got to be from the point of view of anyone but a victim or a police officer. So, like,
Hmm.
most of the class was like, oh, damn it. And I was like, who are you going to write it about then? And I thought, well, maybe he had a wife. So,
Right.
I wrote it from the perspective. And it had such a strong reaction
From the group.
from the group.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone was like, oh, that's interesting.
Huh.
And that was it. I forgot about it. And then I managed financially and, got in the place where I was a bit older, I could take the master's degree, stuck in a workshop, have to come up with an idea. And I had that flash. I remembered that response and I did that idea again. It had exactly the same reaction. So
That's
whenever I was
interesting.
stuck during my MA, I kept going back to that idea for like essays and dissertations and stuff like that, because I honestly, I went to do the MA because I wanted to write stuff and figure out what I wanted to write.
Right.
Because one of the first questions everyone kept asking me on the MA was, what's your genre?"
Right.
I was like,
You're like, I don't
I don't
know.
know.
I don't know what genres are. I went through the same
Yeah,
thing. I was told that I was a thriller writer after I'd written a few books. I'm like, oh, is that what I'm? I have no idea.
yeah, okay. You're like, yes, that's what I do.
Yeah,
And I
it's an
got told,
education.
yeah, and I was told, oh, this is a domestic noir, and I'd never heard of that. So now after I got told that, I was like frisbeeing that out, like everywhere because I thought it sounded really like intelligent and cultured. But so yeah, I kept going back to that book. I did it for my dissertation. I got the worst mark out of all my modules for it.
Hmm.
It dragged my whole master's mark down.
So this was a completed manuscript at this time.
It was, well, what I did, which was where I fell out with my what do you call it, advisor. He said, "You're concentrating on writing a manuscript. I just want you to write a dissertation." And I was
Ah,
using the time off work, and which was a very good advice for a degree.
sure.
But I was using this time off work. I was like, I don't really care about the degree. What I want to do is prove to myself that I can write a book.
Right.
So I kind of did that to myself.
Right.
But you know what? I finished a manuscript.
Right. But you got what you personally needed out of it.
Yeah,
Right. That's the important thing, really.
yeah, yeah. So I got that book, and then I thought, what should I do? And I'd written like a couple of really awful dirges of books, like the floppy disk saga and something before I started.
That's a great title, by the way, the floppy disk saga. I would
It is
totally read
actually
that entire series. I would read.
set in the 90s. Yeah.
Right. Right. Um, so and then you finished this book, and what was your next step? Did you know what to do with it? Did you know maybe I should find an agent? What were your next steps?
So I did, I finished the book, I put it away for a while, I went back to work, did all that sort of stuff that I needed to because I had taken time out to do this. And then I started to reread it and I was like, oh my God, I hate myself. I am the worst
Oh my
writer.
God, you are a writer.
Yeah. I deserve punishment, you know,
Yeah.
hours of self-flagellation later. And I
Right.
started to rewrite it. And I must have rewritten it at least 7 times.
Hmm.
And then, when you're getting to the point where you're like, is it the word, this word or that word? This word or that word? And you think,
That's when I stopped for the day.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was when I got to that point where I was like, well, I could write that word. I was like, do you know what? No. So then I thought, right, I'm going to get an agent. So in my analytical way, I went out and tried to find an agent, and obviously got a lot of rejections. But there was a connection to my agent David through the MA I had, and this is what I say to other people like who've asked me how to get an agent. I'm like, you know what? It's all about like work. It's about networking. So I had volunteered at a writers' festival. I had been a authors gimp. I don't know what you call them. I followed them around and gave them water. Was
GIMP is
basically their
probably correct. Yeah.
gimp. Yeah, faceless gimp for the day. She was lovely. She was with my agent I'm with now, and she
Yeah.
spoke about this agent. I thought he sounds like he's all right. He sounds, because she spoke about how he'd signed her and the feedback he'd given her, which was quite brutal but kind, and he'd really torn her apart in a nice way.
Right.
And I thought, okay, I'm gonna name drop her when I submit and say, oh, she's spoken, this is really awful. I hope my agent never hears this. He'd be like, you creep. Um, so I wrote to him, and I was just in that role of, I went through the writers and artists yearbook. I started at A. I was like, every time I got a rejection, I was like, statistically, I'm closer to getting success.
You
And
are. Yeah.
yeah, in my feeble brain. And loads of people were like, do you think perhaps you're not very good and like you should stop doing this to yourself? Which I think is familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of self-abuse about being a writer, and there's a lot of doubt, and there's a lot of a lack of confidence, which I think, can be a very helpful thing because, for example, I got into writing almost accidentally, so I knew nothing about the industry. And because of that, and because I had never taken any English classes or anything, I had huge doubts about my ability. So when I got rejections, not only was that expected and not deflating, because like who the hell would publish this, but the rejections often, especially when they're coming from New York editors, they came with, this is why we don't like your book. And it was
Cool.
just tremendous advice. I'm like, holy shit,
Yeah.
this is amazing. Like, they're all saying these same things. I can learn from this. So I preach a lot about the power of rejection, because as a writer, you're almost inevitably going to run into a lot of it. I went through 75 rejections before I got an agent, for example. So I think it can make you stronger, but there exists always a lot of self-doubt, I think, with most writers.
Yeah. Well, I was getting it from other people as well, like people in my circle.
Yeah. People who you
So
trusted to give you an unbiased opinion about, because sometimes when you have your circle, but you're like, well, this person doesn't really read this kind of story. So it's hard to distill what they're saying because they're seeing it through a different lens.
yeah, yeah. So the most supportive people were my husband and my daughter,
Yeah.
who don't read books. And I was like, this is
Right.
not helpful.
Right, right. Yeah, you can't. And that's the other end of the spectrum. You can't rely on that either. I found, I joined a critique group about 16, 17 years ago. And, that's tremendous. It's your turn to get, your feet held over the fire, and you sit there and you take it and you start to learn yeah, I agree with this or I don't agree with this, but just having that abuse hurled at you, even if it's nicely done, I think it's hard, but it's a huge learning experience, and it's almost necessary.
Yeah, yeah. I don't mind the abuse. I'm the youngest of four, so I'm used to it.
Yeah, right. You just
Um,
want your voice to be heard.
I just want to be heard. But yeah, so I got a lot of rejections, obviously, which I expected. And then I got a couple of people calling in my manuscript, and then David called in my manuscript, and I went to see him, and it was the most bizarre moment, honestly. Like, I know it sounds really sad and cheesy and a bit lame, but like, I went to see him. I was a nervous wreck.
Yeah,
I literally had to go up. You know, when you're like so nervous, you go, well, I went up like 2 hours early
sure. And just sat there and fretted.
and stared at the location where I needed to be and wondered if anything would happen, that, like I'd walk across the street and like, I get mown down by a black cab, or, like I'm
Right,
here.
right,
I shouldn't drink any more coffee for
right.
sure.
I'll,
And
I'll have to peter in the interview.
yeah,
Right,
and I need the bathroom again.
right.
And I went to see him and we had a great conversation, and he told me some really bad things about the book he didn't like about the book. And I was like, yeah, okay, fine. Um, and he went, that was a test. He said, but you took it quite well.
Yeah,
And he said, I'd be happy to sign you on if you want.
right. Well, so that's so smart, right? Because he's realizing, I'm not going to make any money until I sell something, but I'm going to have to deal with you. And so what
Yeah,
kind of person are you? Are you the person who's going to argue every point? And in which case this is a business. I don't want to be in business with somebody like that.
hard. Yeah.
You're being easy maintenance is, I think, critical. And a lot of authors aren't. I hear that all the time from agents and
See, that's
editors. Like
weird,
this,
isn't it? I hear that all the time. I've not witnessed it, but I quite like being collaborative because I'm so overjoyed and
right? That
excited,
right,
like an annoying person, that anyone would read my book,
right.
that I love hearing about it. I like, even like, I mean, you get bad reviews, and sometimes like the reviews I've read, it's like, oh, it hurts. The stuff that hurts can either be because it's true, it chimes something in you and you're like, yeah, you got a point there, that hurts, but I'm gonna stew on that.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's just not very nice and it makes you think, wow, where's that come from? But
Right, right. That has nothing to do with you or your book, when that's
yeah,
usually the case.
yeah,
It's when there's some kind of, critical consensus about something where you're like, okay, I can understand that. and even in my experiences, I've got my seventh coming out in a few weeks, and it's the same every time. There's always a lot of things wrong with the book. There's always a lot of things that the editor through first pass is going to say, all these things need to change. And every time I look at that, I'm like, oh, 99% of this I totally agree with, and you're making my book better. And if I ever
Yeah.
disagree with something, it's usually something very minor, like a character
Okay.
name or something like that. So that will never end, right? You're never going to write the perfect novel, but you can have a team that can help you make it better. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed. I mean, maybe I'm like speaking too soon because I've only done one book, and I've just submitted my second to the publisher. So touch wood. But I actually, and people said that's really unusual. I really enjoyed working with my editor. Obviously, like you get the notes at first, and you're like, "Ugh."
Right.
But actually, yeah, it was that. It was like, yeah, and it sparks more ideas off, and it's like it's good to have someone to riff with,
Totally.
and it does make it better. It makes it better.
Right. Well, and
So I
they're
actually enjoyed.
yeah, and they're in the business of actually selling the books, so they have a different perspective of, what and they might even suggest something that you don't think is necessary, but you don't contain that same perspective of like, well, we know that the people who read these types of books really like it when X, Y, and Z tends to be present in a novel. And you're like, oh, okay, that's great. So yeah, it's very self-centered to think like, hey man, these are my words and I'm not touching any of them and they're sacrosanct. But
Yeah,
you do hear stories. I think the stories you hear are more from authors that are making a lot more money than we are. So
yeah.
maybe, but
I'm too low maintenance because I'm like, please take
right,
my book.
right. Well, I'm very excited for that you've gone through that debut experience and that you have a second book coming out. We're gonna take just a few minutes to do a quick storytelling because that's kind of the hook of the whole.
Oh
Um,
God. Okay.
I know you're so excited. I can tell.
I'm just petrified.
Oh no, it's really fun because so a couple good things. One, we can edit out any long pauses where we're like, I don't know what to say next. So that's great.
That's good.
And the expectation level is very low. So,
Good.
we've picked out books that are just history books, and all right, this is where we're going to start. But I'm kind of in the mood for picking a Stephen King book. So I'm going to
Okay.
grab a random Stephen King book, and I'll let you pick the page. Be right back.
Okay.
I've got my Stephen King shelf and a half over there somewhere. So this is Dreamcatcher, which I honestly don't remember reading, but I'm sure I did. I have it on my shelf. Yeah, it was a long time ago. So you're going to give me a page number to choose from between 1 and 600.
Wow. 123.
Okay. And then give me a number between like 1 and 5, and that'll be the sentence on the
Three.
page. 3?
Three. Yeah.
Okay. All right. It kind of continues on. All right. So I'm going to read this sentence, and then you're going to add a sentence or two or whatever you want to say afterwards, and then I'll add. And this is going to go on for like 3 minutes. It's not going to go on very long, and I'll just call an end to it at some point. But we'll see where it goes. Where else would I shop, you old bastard? He asked.
Well, I think you should think about the budget, and you should go to a supermarket to get your clothes.
Why do you have to be so goddamn cheap? He said.
I'm not cheap. I'm trying to be frugal. You're spending more money than we earn, she said.
He was tired of it. He wanted something different. Every day, it seemed like they had the same argument. And every day after that argument, he wandered about in his head, thinking what life would be like if suddenly she might not be around anymore.
She was really bored of having the same arguments over and over again and having to hover over her husband like she was parenting him. He wasn't organised, he couldn't control his spending, he was constantly flirting with her friends. How wonderful it would be if he actually cheated on her, then she'd have a really good reason to dump him.
He thought about dumping her more than once, but often thought that wouldn't quite do the trick. He wanted a more permanent solution, one where he didn't even have to hear about her anymore. The idea of her with somebody else was too much to bear. No, she would have to be gone forever.
She'd suggested counselling, he wouldn't go. She'd suggested going on a vacation without any children just to see if there was any spark between them left, but he refused to try anything different. If only he'd just disappear.
I'm going to the store, he said, and he walked over to get his keys and his wallet. He opened up the drawer where they kept the coupons, and there was the bottle of prescription painkillers that was still half full from when he had hurt his knee. He took the bottle out, looked at it, knowing that she couldn't see it in his hand.
She saw how awkwardly he was standing in the hallway. She wondered why he was hovering over where the half-empty bottle of painkillers were. As soon as he left, as he was gone, she made a mental note to check if he had taken them out of the cupboard.
As he was driving, he played the whole scenario out in his head. He would buy that special cola that she liked at the store, something he rarely did because it was too expensive. She would be so happy about it, she wouldn't even ask why it tasted a little bit different. And then as she would slip into unconsciousness, he promised to give her a little kiss on the forehead.
She was thinking about what it would mean to be free. She could never divorce him, she could never leave him, she couldn't take being the guilty party. What did it mean that he'd taken the half-empty bottle of painkillers? Did it mean he was going to go somewhere and overdose and maybe this would be the route to her freedom? There was definitely a reason he'd taken them, she thought. She really needed to be careful. She hoped he didn't come back. She looked at the front door and hoped he'd never walk back through it again and drag his dirty feet through the hallway carpet after she just cleaned it. And for God's sake, she hoped he didn't come back with that god-awful cheap cola he kept insisting on buying her that she then had to lie and pretend she liked.
All right, we're going to call it there. That was great. So I, first of
It's
all,
hard.
no. Did you had a lot of passion there. So
Sorry.
I hope I didn't stir up any any real emotions in you. But I pictured like, yeah, I pictured her having the ultimate upper hand on that when he came back one way or another, but I'm not quite sure how it ends. But it got pretty dark it's fun though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard though. It's hard. But
Oh
yeah, it
no,
is good fun. As
no,
long
you were
as,
great.
like you say, that the expectations are kept very low, I'm okay.
They usually get pretty dark. I've had some where, there are just these long, just pauses. And what I've also noticed is the energy between the two people also makes a difference, right? Because some people can play off of each other better than others, and it's just about that. So yeah, no, that was well done. We didn't have those long pauses that we have to edit out or anything.
Cool. That's good.
So
I'll take that as a win.
well, Claire, what a great pleasure to meet you, and I know you're a night person, but thank you for staying up a little bit later than I would to chat with me. And like I said, I'm thrilled for your book, People of Abandoned Character. That's very exciting, and I just wish you the best success and luck going forward. It's a tremendous road that you're on, and it'll be exciting to see where it goes to.
Thank you. I'm honoured. Thank you for putting up with me and allowing me to witter on at you for an hour. So thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, enjoy the rest of your night. Take care.
Cheers. You too.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. So that was my conversation with Claire. I really enjoyed talking to her, as I do all my guests, and the storytelling part was particularly fun. Yeah, she's fantastic, and as I mentioned earlier, I think she's got a long and successful career as a writer ahead of her. But certainly has done quite well just with her debut novel so far. If you want to find out more about Claire, you can go to clarewhitfieldbooks.com. If you want to find out more about me or subscribe to my newsletter, you can go to carterwilson.com. That's it for this episode of Making It Up. Another episode will be out shortly. In the meantime, take care.